The PS3 had some of the best exclusives from its era. And you know what? Many of them still hold up today. But as the console hardware gets older and more challenging to repair, emulation becomes ever more important to take up the slack. In this video, I will show exactly how playable the PS3 exclusives are when running on RPCS3. It's going to be a long video, so just sit back and relax. Starting off in alphabetical order, we have 3D Heroes, a game that combines Minecraft aesthetics with classic Zelda mechanics. And this one is unstable for me, crashing every time a new area loads in. It looks like fun, so it's a real pity. Ace Combat Infinity requires that I sign into the PlayStation Network, even though I installed its RAP file. I don't know what I did wrong, but I'll just write this one off as a failure. During the first few years of RPCS3's development, gamers affectionately called it the Demon's Soul emulator. I can understand why, since it was one of the first AAA games to become playable. And indeed, it has very smooth performance these days, thanks to aggressive optimization by the developers. Not even shader compilation can affect the frame rate anymore. Formula 1 Championship Edition has strange graphical anomalies in the sky. There is a way to fix it, but that turns off the crowds in the stadiums, so it looks like this still has issues that need to be ironed out. God of War 3 is fully playable, and even better when run with lossless scaling. Given the advanced graphics, it's surprisingly stable, although performance is still affected by shader compilation. There are performance patches, but I don't like how they affect the overall appearance, so I didn't use them. God of War Ascension is more demanding than God of War 3, and despite that, I managed to get it running at a decent frame rate with lossless scaling. The game does require all of its updates to launch on the emulator. And even then, there's a lot of settings to change, plus patches to disable anti-aliasing and motion blur. Stability is still an issue, however. It's not that uncommon to experience crashes. Gran Turismo 5 couldn't quite maintain 60 frames per second at all times, but even at 40, it was perfectly fine, without hitches, slowdowns, or audio crackles. I did end up locking the frame rate to 30, but it wasn't really necessary. The wiki warns that buying cars at dealerships will crash the game, but when I did it, none of that happened, so maybe that's been fixed. Gran Turismo 6 proved to be very problematic for me. I followed several guides online to fix its numerous graphical issues. None were fruitful. I even tested with different game updates, and there were quite a few. At native resolution, the bugs were reduced to broken car reflections. But the performance was barely acceptable when running with lossless scaling, so this one isn't ready yet. Despite being labeled as fully playable in the wiki, Heavenly Sword was not stable for me. It kept freezing or crashing, no matter what I tried. Infamous has always been hard to run on the emulator, but nowadays you can get a fairly stable performance by simply locking the frame rate to 30 and pairing it with lossless scaling. That's how I play it, and to be honest, it's okay. The same can be said of its sequel, which needs lossless scaling for more than just performance. At the moment, you'll get graphical bugs if you upscale the graphics, and since it looks a bit blurry at 720p, lossless scaling can make it a little bit more acceptable. The game's expansion is more or less the same. I had no problems running it. The Jak Daxter Collection still has some unresolved issues with its graphics, especially particle effects around smoke and fire. Killzone 2 has some issues like lights being visible through walls and occasional crashing. Other than that, it was fairly stable, and I would consider it fully playable. Just bear in mind that gyro controllers are required, and music can sometimes be a bit loud. Killzone 3 is similar to Killzone 2, but it felt a bit more unstable for me. Lights are visible through walls as well, and there are also minor graphical anomalies, although it's not terrible. The game itself feels less sluggish though, especially since the controls are more responsive. Gyro controllers are required again. LittleBigPlanet refuses to run unless you update the game to the latest version, and even then, it does have a few minor visual bugs. It's fully playable though. LittleBigPlanet 2 doesn't have any glitches, but I did experience several annoying crashes. It's recommended to update to the latest version and to disable anti-aliasing with game patches. LittleBigPlanet 3 is fine as long as you run at native resolution. If you upscale the graphics, you'll get visual bugs. So just use lossless scaling to raise the fidelity. Metal Gear Solid 4 is a little unstable. Sometimes when I traveled between areas, the game would hang or soft lock, but it always continued working when I restarted. Performance is fine though, and always at or above 30 frames per second. I used the 60 frames per second patch since it was advised for a more playable experience. When paired with lossless scaling, it's even better. In the wiki, Motorstorm is still labelled as in-game, but for me, it was surprisingly problem-free. There were no crashes, slowdowns, or bugs to speak of. I've always preferred these racing games to Gran Turismo, so I'm glad to finally play it. Motorstorm Pacific Rift can be played with upscaled graphics and without issues. Apparently the grass looks pixelated when you play at higher than 720p resolution, but I didn't see any of that. There are a few patches you should consider though, like disabling motion blur and dynamic resolution scaling. Overall, this is a great game, and the most fun I had in the series. Motorstorm Apocalypse was prone to crashing at the start, but the longer I played, the more stable it became. Performance was very nice, and graphics were phenomenal. Just bear in mind that some effects need to be disabled in patches, like motion blur and anti-aliasing. Puppeteer is fine with patches. It's important to disable anti-aliasing if you upscale the graphics, otherwise you'll get graphical bugs. Ratchet Clank, Tools of Destruction has minor frame drops between loading areas. Apart from that, you should change from surround sound to stereo to avoid audio issues. Ratchet & Clank, Quest for Booty has some graphical issues like the water rendering, for example. There was nothing else to complain about except for one crash in the beginning of the game. Resistance Fall of Man had no problems. Even when shaders were caching, frames remained solid. It's not an amazing looking shooter, so its performance is hardly surprising. Still, it's one of those must-play games from the PS3 era, so if you're itching for something to play, this is probably what you're looking for. Resistance 2 was reasonably good in terms of performance and only stuttered briefly when new areas loaded in, although it did crash once during a cutscene. The game's wiki is very sparse, so I had to rely on my own experience, raising the driver wake-up delay to 80. It seemed to help, and I didn't have crashes again. Resistance 3 runs surprisingly well, especially when you consider how impressive its graphics are. Honestly, it performed as well as the first game and it never crashed. The wiki does warn that aiming down a sniper scope will crash the game, but honestly, you can probably finish the campaign by simply not looking down scopes. Ridge Racer 7 is apparently unstable when running with the PPU decoder's recompiler setting. The problem is, if you go with the static interpreter, your frame rate is practically halved. So I decided to go for instability, expecting a lot of crashing and freezing. However, the game had absolutely no problems for me. Maybe the wiki page just needs an update, who knows? Thieves in Time was the last Sly Cooper game ever made, and I must say, it went out with a bang. It's a great game, and it runs very light on my hardware. I managed to launch Socom 4 once by following a very specific guide. It had glitchy graphics, but looked playable. Yet, when I restarted the emulator and tried to start the game a second time, it wouldn't get past the loading screen. Starhawk is a third-person action game, but you wouldn't know it by looking at the screen. The graphics are completely broken. In Tales of Xillia and its sequel, audio effects and music will sometimes cut out during cutscenes unless you modify a specific config file inside the game's folder. It's a bit annoying, but at least there are no other issues. Twisted Metal became unresponsive after entering the story mode. I could see that the emulator was still operating in the background, but unfortunately there was just a black screen for me, so it's unplayable. Yakuza Dead Souls is an underrated gem and only available on PS3 for some weird reason. and here it plays perfectly fine. There were no issues to speak of. But okay, this will conclude the important games that I wanted to cover, but there are more that I consider fully playable. And here they are in a nice music montage. Enjoy! Alright, that's it for this video. If you found it useful, remember to give a like. Thanks for watching and have a nice day.